Walter Cole had borrowed the suit from his neighbor Dennis. Dennis was 2 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier, and the suit showed it. The shoulders sat slightly wide, the sleeves came down a fraction too far, but Dennis had pressed it carefully the night before and hung it on the doorframe with a note that said, "You raised a doctor. We're proud." Walter had read the note twice. Then he had folded it and put it in the breast pocket of the suit, next to his reading glasses and his daughter's graduation program, which he had been carrying since it arrived in the mail 11 days ago and had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. He did not own luggage. He had borrowed a small bag from the same neighbor and packed it the way a man packs who has spent 35 years solving structural problems, methodically, without wasted space, everything in its correct place. He drove himself to the airport. He had printed his boarding pass at the library because he did not own a printer and did not trust the application on his phone, which his daughter Sophie had installed for him 6 months ago and which he had accidentally deleted twice since then. He found a gate. He sat in the plastic chair and waited. He was 68 years old and had not flown in 11 years and was quietly, privately terrified. He did not show this. He had raised a child alone for 19 years after his wife Margaret passed. He had learned a long time ago that the things you were afraid of did not become smaller by showing them to other people. When the gate agent called his name and explained about the upgrade, something about overbooking, something about system reallocation, she was very kind and spoke quickly. Walter had nodded and thanked her and found seat 14A the way he found everything, by looking carefully until he understood where he was supposed to be. He sat down. He buckled his belt. He took out the graduation program. He checked it was still there. He put it back. He looked out the window at the tarmac. The man who sat down beside him looked at Walter once. Then he pressed the call button. And what happened next, in the 4 minutes that followed, in the 30,000 feet of air above Ohio, in the paper folded inside a plastic bag, would end with that man standing in the aisle. And Walter Cole remaining exactly where he was. Walter Cole had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the heat sometimes worked and the education always did. His father had been a factory floor supervisor for 22 years. His mother had taught 3rd grade. They were not wealthy people. They were precise people, careful with money, careful with words, certain about a small number of things, and not inclined to pretend certainty about anything else. Walter had inherited this from both of them in equal measure. He had studied civil engineering at Ohio State on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, graduating in 1979 with a degree and a debt he paid off over 7 years without complaint. He had spent 35 years working for the Ohio Department of Transportation, then a private infrastructure firm, then back to the state in a senior consulting capacity. He had worked on 41 bridges. 3 of them were significant enough that engineers who came after him knew his name in connection with them. Not because Walter had told anyone, but because the documentation was thorough and the work was correct, and correct work left a record whether the man who did it sought credit or not. He had met Margaret at a department function in 1984. She was a hydrologist with a laugh that arrived before she intended it to, and a habit of asking the second question when everyone else stopped at the first. They had been married for 14 years before she was diagnosed. Sophie had been 9 years old when Margaret passed. Walter had sat with Sophie that evening, on the same couch, in the same living room, where they still sat together when Sophie came home to visit, and he had told her the truth in the plain way he told her everything. That her mother was gone, that they were going to be all right. That all right did not mean easy, and he was not going to pretend it did. Sophie had looked at him with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old who is deciding whether to trust what she is being told. And she had leaned against him, and Walter had put his arm around her. And they had sat there for a long time without saying anything more, because some things did not require more words. They only required presence. Walter had raised Sophie the way he approached everything, methodically, honestly, without pretending to know what he did not know, and without flinching from what he did. He helped her with mathematics until she surpassed him at 14. He drove her to her science competitions on Saturday mornings, waited in gymnasium hallways reading engineering journals, drove her home, asked her what she had learned. He did not tell her what to study. He did not tell her what to become. He asked questions. Sophie had told him once, during her doctoral program, that explaining her research to him on their Sunday phone calls had clarified her thinking more than any academic discussion she had in the department. "You asked the right questions, Dad," she had said. "Because I don't know the answers," Walter had said. "That's exactly why," Sophie had said. Richard Ashworth was 44 years old and ran a private equity firm that managed assets across infrastructure, logistics, and emerging market development. He had built the firm over 15 years from a 2-person operation in a shared office to a 40-person organization with 3 international offices and a portfolio that institutional investors described, in the particular language of that world, as consistently performing. He was not a bad man in the way that people who enjoy being bad are bad. He was a man who had moved through the world so efficiently for so long that he had stopped noticing the friction his efficiency created in other people. He sat in 14B the way he always sat. Laptop open before the tray table was fully down, phone silent, but face up, a specific efficiency of movement that came from boarding planes 3 times a week for 15 years. He looked at Walter once. The borrowed suit, the paper boarding pass, the worn paperback being removed from a plastic shopping bag, the graduation program checked and replaced. Richard did not form a conscious judgment. He formed a conclusion the way efficient men form conclusions, quickly from available data, without pausing to ask whether the data was complete. He pressed the call button. Maya arrived. She had been a flight attendant for 12 years and had a precise internal categorization of the different types of passengers who pressed the call button before the seatbelt sign was off. She recognized this type immediately. Richard spoke quietly, just above the ambient sound of the cabin. Not quietly enough. "This gentleman may be in the wrong section. Could you verify his boarding pass?" Walter looked up from his paperback. He looked at Maya. He did not yet understand what was happening. He handed over his boarding pass with both hands, the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to hand things to people properly. Maya looked at it. She looked at Richard. She said, "His seat is correct, sir. He's been upgraded by the system due to an overbooking situation in economy." Richard looked at the boarding pass, then at Walter. "Upgraded on what basis?" Walter said, helpfully in the tone of a man providing useful information. "The lady at the gate was very kind. She explained something about the system. I didn't entirely follow it, but she said seat 14A. He smiled at Richard. Richard did not smile back. He turned to Maya. "I'd like to speak to the senior flight attendant." Maya said, "Of course, sir." She walked to the forward galley. Walter looked out the window. He was not embarrassed. He was not angry. He was slightly confused in the way of a man who has done nothing wrong and cannot yet locate the nature of the problem. James arrived. 19 years with the airline. Former Royal Air Force, 6 years, ground operations. A man whose patience had been built in environments where impatience cost more than time. He listened to Richard completely. He looked at Walter's boarding pass. He looked at Richard. He said, "The seat assignment is correct. The upgrade was issued by the airline under standard overbooking protocol. The passenger is in the right seat." Richard said, "What are the criteria for upgrade selection?" James said, "Booking history and loyalty program status." Richard was quiet for a moment. His loyalty program status. It was not entirely a question. James looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. "Is there anything else I can help you with, sir?" Richard said nothing. James returned to the forward galley. Walter, who had followed the exchange with the careful attention of a man who takes things seriously, turned to Richard. He said, "I'm sorry if there's been some confusion. I can ask them if there's a different arrangement," Richard said. "It's fine." He opened his laptop. He did not look at Walter again. Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he opened his paperback. He found his page. He began to read. The turbulence began 90 minutes into the flight. Moderate at first, the particular rhythm of air pockets over the Great Lakes that experienced flyers recognized and dismissed, and then stronger, a sustained rolling motion that caused drinks to shift on tray tables and one passenger 3 rows back to make a sound of surprise. Walter's hand went to the armrest. His knuckles were not white, but they were close. Richard noticed. He said, without looking up from his laptop, "It's just air mass variation over the lakes. The aircraft is completely stable." Walter said, "How do you know?" Richard looked up. "I've flown this route approximately 200 times. This pattern is standard. It will pass in 15 to 20 minutes. Walter nodded. His grip on the armrest loosened slightly. He said, "Thank you. I appreciate that." He meant it. Richard looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to his laptop. The turbulence continued. Walter looked out the window. After a moment he said, not to Richard particularly, but to the general air of the cabin, "My wife was never afraid of flying. She said if the engineers did their jobs correctly, there was nothing to worry about. She was a scientist. She trusted data." Richard did not respond. Walter continued looking out the window. "She passed 11 years ago. I haven't flown since her funeral. I decided it was time." A pause. "My daughter is receiving her doctorate today. I wasn't going to miss it for something as manageable as being frightened." Richard closed his laptop. "Not fully. Halfway." He said, "What is her doctorate in?" Walter looked at him. "Structural engineering. Bridge load distribution systems specifically." Richard said, "Where?" Walter named the university. Richard was quiet for a moment. "Under which department head?" Walter told him. Richard looked at his laptop screen, then back at Walter. "What is her name?" Walter said, "Sophie. Dr. Sophie Cole, as of this afternoon." Something shifted in Richard Ashworth's expression. Not dramatically. The way a precise instrument shifts when it detects something it was not calibrated for. He said, "Does she publish?" Walter reached into the plastic bag. He produced a folded photocopy, creased at the fold lines, slightly soft at the corners from handling. He said, "She sent me this when it came out. I've read it 4 times. I understand approximately half of it. She says that's better than most." He handed it to Richard with both hands. Richard unfolded it. He read the title. He read the author line. He read the institutional affiliation. He read the abstract. He turned to page 2. He read. He did not speak. He read for 6 minutes. The turbulence had stopped. He did not notice. When he looked up, his expression had shed the particular efficiency it had carried since he sat down. What was underneath was something more straightforward. He said, "Dr. Sophie Cole is your daughter." Walter said, "Yes." "This paper," Richard said and stopped. He looked at the pages in his hands. He said, 3 weeks ago, I presented this methodology to my investment committee. We have committed $200 million to an infrastructure project in the Pacific Northwest that is built on the framework your daughter developed. This research solves a load distribution problem in suspension bridge construction that has been an active obstacle in the field for over 20 years. He folded the paper. He held it for a moment. Then he handed it back to Walter with both hands. Walter took it. He put it back in a plastic bag. He looked out the window. Below them, through a break in the clouds, a river was visible, silver and thin from this height, winding through a landscape that from 30,000 feet looked like something a careful person had drawn. Walter said, "She used to call me on Sunday evenings and explain her work, step by step. She said it helped her think." He paused. "I asked a lot of questions. I didn't understand most of the answers, but I kept asking." He looked at the plastic bag in his lap. "She told me once that the right question is worth more than the right answer, because the answer only solves one problem. The question opens 10 more." Richard looked at him. Walter looked back. The same look he had given Richard at the beginning, open, direct, without agenda. He said, "Do you have children?" Richard said, "2, 6 and 8. Walter nodded. "The years move faster than you expect." He picked up his paperback. He found his page. He went back to reading. Richard sat beside him and looked at the seat back in front of him for a long time. Then he opened his laptop. He did not look at his emails. He opened the file for the Pacific Northwest project. He read it differently than he had read it before. The plane landed at 3:42 in the afternoon. The city outside the terminal windows was bright with early autumn light, the particular gold of a season that knows it is almost finished and is making the most of the time remaining. Passengers stood and reached for overhead bags with the collective impatience of people who had been sitting for 4 hours and were ready to be somewhere else. Walter stood carefully. He retrieved his borrowed bag from the overhead compartment, placed there by a younger man across the aisle who had offered without being asked, which Walter had accepted with genuine thanks. He put on his jacket. He straightened his shoulders, the ones that sat slightly too wide. He checked his breast pocket. Reading glasses. Graduation program. Dennis's note. Still there. Richard Ashworth was standing in the aisle. He was holding a business card. He said, "The advisory board I mentioned. For the infrastructure project. We're building it now. People who can speak to practical application from an engineering background. Not theoretical, not academic. People who have actually built things. He held out the card. I'd like to send your daughter a formal proposal. If she's open to it. Walter looked at the card. He took it. He held it with the same careful attention he had given everything today. The boarding pass, the graduation program, the paper he had read 4 times and understood half of. He put it in his breast pocket. I'll pass it along, he said. Though I should tell you, she makes her own decisions. She has since she was about 12. I stopped advising her on professional matters around the same time she stopped needing it. He paused, which was also around 12. Richard looked at him. Something in his face that had not been there at the beginning of the flight. He said, how did you raise someone like that? Walter considered the question in the real way, the way he had always considered things, without hurrying to an answer before the answer was ready. He said, I asked her questions. I told her the truth. I showed up. He picked up his plastic bag. That's all I did. The rest was her. He moved into the aisle. James was at the forward door. As Walter passed, James said, enjoy the graduation, sir. Walter stopped. How did you know? James smiled. You've been holding that program since before boarding. You check it every 40 minutes or so. I noticed. Walter looked down. The graduation program was in his hand. He had not realized he was holding it. He laughed. A real laugh, small and unguarded. The laugh of a man who has been caught doing something human and doesn't mind at all. He thanked James. He walked down the jetway. Richard Ashworth stood at the door of the plane and watched him go. An older man in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, carrying a plastic shopping bag, walking through an airport terminal toward his daughter's graduation with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had nowhere more important to be and knew it. Richard had met many people in 15 years of business. He had sat across from founders and fund managers and heads of state and people whose names appeared on buildings. He could not think of one who had left him feeling the particular way he felt standing at that gate watching Walter Cole walk away. He picked up his phone. He called his office. Pull everything we have on Dr. Sophie Cole and the Pacific Northwest Structural Project. Full review on my desk tomorrow morning. His assistant said, of course. Anything else? Richard thought for a moment. He said, send flowers to the graduation ceremony today. University of, he named it, Sophie Cole's doctoral graduation. Make them significant. Not corporate. Significant. To whom should we address the card? Richard looked at the jetway. At the place where Walter Cole had been. He said, to her father. Right. For asking the right questions. With respect, R. Ashworth. He ended the call. He stood at the gate for a moment longer. Then he picked up his bag and walked in the opposite direction. Sophie Cole received her doctorate at 4:15 that afternoon. She walked across the stage in a black gown with the particular composure of someone who has worked toward a single moment for 6 years and is allowing herself, finally, to arrive at it. She found her father in the audience the moment she reached the podium. Third row. Borrowed suit, slightly too wide at the shoulders. Graduation program in his hands. Watching her with the expression she had known her entire life. Not pride exactly, though it was that too. Something steadier than pride. The expression of a man who had always believed she would be here and was simply glad to be in the room when it happened. She held up her diploma. Just for a second. Just for him. Walter Cole looked at his daughter holding that diploma in the afternoon light of a university auditorium. He thought about Margaret, who would have made a sound of pure joy at this moment and not cared who heard it. He thought about 35 years of bridges that were still standing. He thought about Sunday phone calls and right questions and a paper he had read 4 times and understood half of. He thought about a borrowed suit and a printed boarding pass and a plastic bag and a man in 14B who had pressed a call button and then, 6 minutes later, handed a piece of paper back with both hands. He thought about all of it, and then he stopped thinking about all of it because Sophie was looking at him, and that was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. He smiled at her. She smiled back. The auditorium was full of sound. Walter Cole heard none of it. The flowers arrived at the reception afterward. A large arrangement, not corporate, not generic. Flowers that someone had chosen with care. White and soft yellow, the kind that lasted. Sophie read the card. She read it twice. She looked at her father. Who is R. Ashworth? Walter said, a man I sat next on the plane. Sophie looked at the card again. for asking the right questions. She looked up. What did you say to him? Walter thought about it. Nothing I haven't said to you. Sophie looked at her father in the borrowed suit with a note from the neighbor still in his breast pocket. She put her arm through his. She said, "Come on. There's food." Walter let his daughter lead him toward the reception table. He did not look back at the flowers. He did not need to. Some things do not require a last look. They only require that you were present for all the moments that led to them. Walter Cole had been present for every single one.